Welcome back to Hope Tales. Today's story is about a tourist who never trained for flying, never touched a cockpit, yet in one terrifying moment, every life on that plane depended on her. The morning sun drifted gently over the airport terminal, turning the glass panels into sheets of gold. Among the hundreds of passengers walking in different directions, one girl moved quietly, clutching a small backpack and an old camera. She was just a tourist, nothing more, nothing less. A girl who loved capturing mountains, skies, and faces of strangers. She had no idea that within hours, her name would be tied to an event that would shake the aviation world. She boarded the aircraft like everyone else, unaware that her simple vacation flight would soon turn into a battle between life, fate, and courage. The cabin buzzed with the soft sounds of passengers settling in. A baby cried softly. A couple argued about window seats. A tired businessman tried to type a few last-minute emails before takeoff. Everything felt normal, too normal, like the calm that hides behind storms. The tourist found her seat near the wing, pressed her forehead against the window, and admired the massive engine beneath. She loved airplanes. She loved the hum of power beneath the metal, the science that allowed steel birds to rise above clouds. She wasn't a pilot, not even close. She had only watched documentaries and read travel magazines. Yet today, destiny had quietly placed her in the one seat that would matter most. As the plane pushed back and the engines roared to life, the girl felt that familiar thrill of takeoff, the sudden rush, the vibration, the moment when wheels leave the earth behind. The aircraft climbed steadily, slicing through layers of clouds that glowed like silver mountains. For an hour, the flight remained peaceful. Flight attendants moved gracefully through the aisles. The passengers relaxed, some sleeping, others watching movies. Then slowly something began to change. The tourist noticed a faint burning smell. At first she thought it was her imagination, maybe the cabin ovens or someone heating food. But the smell grew sharper, more distinct, like overheated metal. The engine outside her window didn't sound wrong, but something about the rhythm felt uneasy, like a heartbeat skipping a beat every few seconds. Inside the cockpit, unseen by passengers, warning lights had begun flickering. A subtle electrical fault, hidden deep within the system, had triggered a chain reaction. Sensors began giving inconsistent readings. Autopilot struggled to interpret the data. The flight crew, although experienced, suddenly found themselves fighting to understand what was happening. Back in the cabin, lights flickered for a moment. A brief flash, barely noticeable to most, but enough to make the tourist glance up with concern. She scanned the cabin, noticing how everyone else remained, unaware of the tension silently, forming around them. The flight attendant by the galley looked uneasy, glancing repeatedly toward the cockpit door. Minutes later, turbulence struck. Not heavy but unusual, sharp jolts, as if the aircraft was hitting invisible walls. The passengers stirred, some clutching their armrests. The engine still sounded healthy, but the aircraft felt different, like it was struggling to stay balanced. The tourist's instincts sharpened. She lifted her camera and zoomed in on the wing. She noticed something, a faint trail of smoke, almost invisible but definitely there. Her heart skipped. She tightened her grip on the camera. The vibrations intensified. The overhead bins rattled. The aircraft suddenly dipped, not drastically, but enough to steal a collective gasp from the cabin. The flight attendants rushed down the aisle, their movements quick but controlled, their expressions hiding fear behind professionalism. Something inside the tourist whispered that this was no ordinary turbulence. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. The plane jerked again, this time harder. Loose items rolled across the floor. The screens flickered. A deep shudder ran through the aircraft as if the metal frame itself was groaning against an unseen force. And then for a brief second, one engine coughed, just once, but loud enough for anyone near the wing to hear. Her breath caught. Smoke rose again, more visible now. The passengers around her panicked. Some fumbled with seatbelts. Some pressed call buttons repeatedly. The energy in the cabin shifted from mild concern to rising fear, a fear that spread like a wave. The aircraft began losing altitude, not rapidly but steadily. The horizon outside tilted slightly. The tourist closed her eyes for a moment, trying to calm the racing thoughts inside her head. She remembered things she had learned from aviation, documentaries, signs of engine overheating, early indicators of power system failure, and, most importantly, how to stay conscious and rational in emergencies. She didn't know it yet, but everything she had casually absorbed over the years would soon become a lifeline. Suddenly, the cabin lights dimmed. The aircraft shook again, and then silence. Not complete silence, but a frightening reduction in engine noise, the kind that hits like a punch to the chest. The passengers screamed. The toddler cried. A flight attendant stumbled but held onto the seat back. The tourist inhaled deeply. Her heartbeat thundered, but she steadied herself. She knew enough to recognize the signs. The aircraft was struggling. Communication systems were flickering. The pilots were fighting to keep control. And then it happened. A loud thud echoed from the front. Not from the engine, no. From the cockpit. The flight attendant closest to the door froze, her eyes widening. Something had gone terribly wrong inside. The tourist unbuckled slightly, leaning forward to see. The aircraft tilted again, more sharply. Panic erupted. The situation had crossed a line from technical emergency to human emergency. The tourist's hands trembled, but her mind focused like never before. She didn't know yet, but in the next part, she would become the one person on board capable of making the impossible decision. The one who would be pushed into a place no tourist should ever be. A place where she would have to step forward. Because the pilots were no longer able to save the plane. Panic spread through the cabin like wildfire. A rising wave of fear that no one could control. The aircraft, once stable and peaceful, now trembled with a deep, uneven vibration that felt like the heartbeat of something struggling to survive. The tourist gripped the armrests tightly as the plane dipped again, this time more sharply. Loose cups and blankets slid across the aisle. Oxygen masks trembled above, ready to deploy with one more violent shake. At the front of the cabin, the cockpit door stood half open for a moment as a flight attendant rushed inside. The tourist caught a glimpse, just a second, but enough to see something terribly wrong. One of the pilots was slumped sideways in his seat, motionless, head tilted at an unnatural angle. The other pilot struggled with the controls, his hands shaking, sweat pouring down his forehead as warning lights flashed wildly across the entire panel. The flight attendant quickly shut the door, but the tourist had already seen enough. She knew the situation had crossed into a zone no one ever wanted to face. Inside the sealed cockpit, chaos reigned, alarms beeping, displays blinking, autopilot disengaging repeatedly, forcing manual control. The aircraft seemed to fight the pilot's every command, dipping and rolling as if pulled by invisible currents. The engine on the right wing coughed again, a deep, frightening sound, then stabilized. But smoke continued to trail from beneath the metal casing. The cabin lights flickered, plunging everything into brief darkness before returning in a dim glow. Gasps filled the air. Children began to cry. The tourist felt her pulse pounding through her entire body. Yet beneath the fear, something inside her became strangely calm. Not fearless, just focused. The kind of focus that comes only when someone realizes there is no one else to rely on but themselves. The flight attendants huddled near the galley, whispering frantically, their expressions tight with fear. One of them, hands trembling, tried to steady herself as she picked up the intercom phone. But before she could speak, the aircraft suddenly dropped, hard. A terrifying lurch that sent passengers upward before, slamming them back into their seats. Screams echoed through the cabin. Baggage compartments burst open, luggage falling onto the aisle. The tourist braced her feet and held on to the seat in front of her as the plane leveled out again. Her breaths came sharp and fast, but her eyes stayed fixed on the cockpit door. Something wasn't right. Something was happening in there that no one was explaining. Moments later, one of the flight attendants rushed down the aisle, holding a portable breathing kit. She knocked quickly on the cockpit door and slipped inside when it opened half an inch. The door shut again, but in that fraction of a second, the tourist caught another glimpse. Now both pilots were in trouble. The captain had collapsed, lying halfway out of his seat. The first officer struggled. But even from the brief glimpse, the tourist could see he wasn't fully conscious. His movements slow and unstable. His hand slipped from the throttle, dropping dangerously before he grabbed it again. Warning lights cast red. Flashes across his pale face. The tourist felt a chill run through her. She had seen aviation documentaries describing pilot incapacitation, decompression sickness, oxygen issues, contamination, or sudden illness. Whatever it was happening now. 33,000 feet above the Earth, and the plane was flying without a functioning pilot. The aircraft jolted again, banking to the left in a slow, uncontrolled roll before autopilot attempted to re-engage and straighten it. But the system was damaged, confused by failing sensors and electrical faults. The plane wobbled back to level, but not stably, like a bird with one wing injured, struggling to stay airborne. The tourist's mind raced. She knew she had no formal training, no certificate, nothing that qualified her to even approach the cockpit. She was just a traveler with curiosity for aviation videos. But at that moment, she remembered something. Many crashes had been prevented by ordinary passengers, who stepped up when pilots could not. And more importantly, she remembered something else. If the pilots were down, the next 10 minutes would decide the fate of every single person on board. Her breathing steadied. She looked around the cabin, at the terrified faces. Crying children, elderly passengers clutching hands, flight attendants shaken to their core. She wasn't a hero. She didn't think like one. But something inside her refused to sit frozen in fear while the plane spiraled closer to disaster. But before she could move, oxygen masks dropped with a violent hiss. The cabin pressure had just fallen. People grabbed at masks, screaming, fumbling. The tourist quickly pulled hers over her face. She inhaled sharply, feeling the rush of oxygen fill her lungs. The plane dipped again, this time more violently. The wing outside her window vibrated dangerously, smoke growing thicker. She knew what low cabin pressure meant. It could incapacitate the pilots even faster. A flight attendant stumbled through the aisle, signaling everyone to remain calm, though her own eyes glistened with rising panic. She leaned close to the tourist, trying to steady her voice but failing. Something like silent communication passed between them. The tourist didn't need words to understand. This was a disaster beyond anything the crew had trained for. Minutes passed like hours. The masks dangled. The aircraft shook. The cockpit remained sealed, silent except for muffled alarms barely audible through the door. And then it happened. The cockpit door opened slightly, and a flight attendant stepped out with a look that told the entire truth. The pilots were down. The autopilot was failing. The aircraft had no one fully capable of flying it. The flight attendant looked around the cabin, desperately searching for anyone at all, with aviation experience. A former pilot, a student, a crew member off duty, someone who could help. But no one responded. No one raised a hand. No one stepped forward. The flight attendant's eyes filled with hopeless fear. The tourist felt her heart sink. She waited for someone to get up. Someone better. Someone smarter. Someone stronger. But no one did. And then, something inside her changed. Her legs moved before her mind even caught up. She unclipped her seatbelt. The cabin swayed. She steadied herself with the seats. Her steps were shaky, but she moved forward toward the cockpit door. Passengers watched her with wide, confused eyes. Some whispered. Some cried harder. The flight attendant saw her approaching and froze. The tourist swallowed hard, feeling her entire world tilt with the trembling plane. She wasn't a pilot. She wasn't trained. She was just a tourist. But she was the only one walking toward the door, the only one not frozen in terror, the only one willing to try. When she reached the cockpit, the flight attendant's voice trembled, and the tourist stepped inside, into a space where thousands of lives across aviation history had been saved or lost. The moment she stepped into the cockpit, the world behind her disappeared. The screams, the shaking cabin, the falling luggage, all of it faded into a distant echo. Only the tight, suffocating space of the cockpit existed now, glowing red with warnings and flashing indicators. The air smelled of overheated wires, oxygen, and fear. The captain lay motionless, half slumped out of his seat, his headset dangling uselessly. His breathing was shallow, his face pale. The first officer wasn't much better. He fought to keep his eyes open, his hands trembling uncontrollably as he tried to hold on to the controls. Sweat dripped down his forehead, sliding down his cheeks as the aircraft rolled slightly again. The tourist froze for a heartbeat, overwhelmed by the sight. This was no flight simulator video, no documentary, no harmless clip on her screen at home. This was real. Terrifyingly, dangerously real, but she forced herself to move, stepping forward with trembling hands. She stared at the instrument panel, layers of buttons, Displays and indicators she barely understood. The aircraft shook again, harder. Warning chimes pulsed repeatedly. A red light blinked furiously on the autopilot panel, indicating system failure. The plane dropped a few hundred feet in a sudden jolt, causing her to grab the side of the seat to keep from falling. She forced herself to breathe. "Think," she told herself, "think!" She had spent hours watching breakdowns of emergencies, analyzing why planes crashed, learning which small mistakes turned into disasters. She knew bits and pieces, tiny fragments of knowledge, scattered across her memory like puzzle pieces. And now, under the crushing pressure of the moment, those pieces began falling into place. The first officer made a weak attempt to hold the controls, but his arms failed him. His vision blurred. His voice barely left his lips. He tried to stay conscious, but his body was shutting down rapidly. Whatever had struck the pilots, oxygen issue or sudden medical collapse, it wasn't over. The tourist looked at the controls. The yoke trembled in place, resisting every movement. The altitude was dropping slowly. The engine temperature on the right side showed an abnormal spike, followed by fluctuating readings. The plane wasn't falling out of the sky, not yet, but it was losing the battle to stay stable. She swallowed hard, reached for the captain's seat, and gently pulled him back just enough to sit in his place. Her hands shook violently as she touched the yoke. It was heavier than she expected, alive, vibrating, fighting against her grip. The aircraft dipped again. She pulled back slightly, not too much, remembering how sensitive controls could be. The plane steadied for a moment, a fleeting moment, but it was enough. She scanned the primary display. Altitude decreasing, speed fluctuating, right engine temperature high, navigation uncertain due to sensor faults. The horizon line on the screen wobbled like a loose thread in the wind. Behind her, the flight attendant stood frozen in the doorway, gripping the frame, eyes wide with fear. She didn't speak. No one dared to. The weight of the moment pressed on them like a mountain. The tourist focused again. She pushed buttons she had seen pilots touch in countless videos, a failing autopilot switch, a diagnostic reset, a secondary stabilizer. Several buttons did nothing. Some reset briefly, then failed again. Still, the plane responded, slightly smoother than before. She wasn't flying it, not fully, but she was preventing it from falling. She forced herself to remember, a plane in the sky wants to fly. It resists crashing. If kept level, it can glide. If kept steady, it can hold. The thought gave her a spark of courage. She read the engine data. The right engine was failing slowly, maybe seconds or minutes before it would drop power. The left engine worked harder, compensating. The aircraft trembled from the imbalance. Another warning blinked. Cabin pressure unstable. That explained the pilots. The oxygen system might have malfunctioned. She checked the cockpit masks. They weren't on. Her heart tightened. She reached forward, placed the captain's mask on his face, then the first officer's. A small hope. They might regain consciousness. The aircraft rolled sharply, pulling her back into the seat. She gripped the controls, steadying it with both hands. Her arms shook under the strain, but the plane slowly, painfully, leveled out. Outside the windshield, endless clouds stretched in every direction. The world looked peaceful, almost mocking the chaos happening inside. The radio crackled softly, static, broken transmissions, unanswered calls. The pilots hadn't made a distress call. No one knew the plane was in trouble. They were alone. The tourist scanned the radio panel. She didn't know aviation frequencies perfectly, but she remembered common distress channels from videos, basic aviation knowledge, drilled into memory from sheer interest. She attempted to tune one with nervous fingers, but signal interference continued. The electrical fault had affected radio communication, too. The plane shuddered again, forcing her to focus on stability instead of communication. Minutes crawled like hours. The cabin behind her was silent except for sobs, prayers, and panicked breathing. Passengers had no idea whether they were seconds from disaster or moments from rescue. The first officer stirred slightly, mask helping, oxygen flowing. His fingers twitched. His eyes fluttered open for a second, seeing her in the captain's seat. But he couldn't speak. He could barely move. He managed only one thing. He lifted a weak hand and pressed a button on the overhead panel, one she hadn't noticed. The display flickered. Backup systems activated in a slow, weak hum. A faint stability returned to the controls. He pointed at another switch, barely raising his hand. The tourist recognized it from aviation clips. Alternate flight control mode. She flicked it. The aircraft steadied slightly more. He wasn't awake enough to fly. Not even close, but he was conscious enough to guide her. Barely. Her heart pounded with hope. The plane was damaged but flyable. The systems were failing but not dead. And she wasn't alone, not entirely. Outside, through the windshield, she saw something piercing the endless clouds, sunlight breaking through, illuminating the path ahead like a silent promise. Her grip tightened on the controls. Her breath steadied. Her mind focused. She had prevented the fall. But landing this plane, that would be a different battle. The cockpit hummed with weakened systems, each light flickering like a dying heartbeat. The tourist sat stiff in the captain's seat, sweat sliding down her face as she gripped the trembling controls. The plane was flying, barely. One engine struggled, coughing through rising smoke. The navigation systems flickered with broken coordinates. But the aircraft was still in the sky, and as long as it stayed there, she still had a chance. The first officer drifted in and out of consciousness beside her. His hand shook weakly as he pointed, toward the altitude screen, dropping. Slowly but steadily. The oxygen mask kept him alive, but not enough to control the aircraft. His eyes, half open, silently pleaded for her to keep going. Behind her, the cabin remained silent except for muffled cries and desperate prayers. Everyone waited. Everyone depended on one girl, a girl who had planned nothing more than a simple vacation, a girl who knew the sky only through pictures and videos. Yet here she was, in the most dangerous seat in aviation. She took a deep breath and scanned the displays again. Airspeed unstable. Engines, one overheating, one overworking. Autopilot, dead. Communications, static and broken. The aircraft trembled as if fighting gravity, metal groaning under pressure. Then she saw something. Through the dense clouds ahead, a faint line, straight, clean, almost glowing. It wasn't a runway. It was sunlight reflecting off the distant ocean, cutting a silver path across the blue surface. They were descending faster than she realized. The plane wasn't going to stay airborne for long. If the engine failed completely, they would glide, whether they wanted to or not. Her heart pounded. She forced herself to remember everything she'd ever learned. Planes glide. Even without power, they glide. If kept level, if kept steady, if kept moving fast enough, they can land on open ground or sea. The thought terrified her. But it was hope. A thin, fragile line of hope she could hold on to. The plane shook violently again. Loose papers flew around the cockpit. A high-pitched alarm echoed through the narrow space. The right engine burst with a brief, bright flash, then power dropped. The gauges fell instantly. What little thrust they had was slipping away. She steadied the controls, fighting the plane's instinct to roll from the imbalance. Her arms strained. Every muscle screamed. Sweat dripped onto the yoke. She felt the plane begin to glide, nose dipping into a shallow, deadly descent. The first officer forced himself upright for a moment. With the last of his strength, he reached out and touched the flaps lever, lowering it slightly. The aircraft responded with a slight lift, slowing the descent by a fraction. His eyes closed again, body slumping forward. But the one small action gave her a chance. The ocean grew larger in the windshield. The clouds thinned. Light reflected across the water like scattered diamonds. She had seconds to choose. Drop too steep, plane breaks apart. Drop too fast, nosedives. Drop wrong angle, wings catch and split. She steadied her breathing. Her hands tightened. She pulled gently, not too much, keeping the nose stable. The plane continued its slow, gliding fall toward the open ocean. Behind her, passengers braced instinctively, though they didn't fully understand what was coming. The cabin filled with a deep, heavy silence, the kind that only happens when everyone knows life is moments from changing forever. The tourist felt the wind pressure shift. The nose dipped slightly. She countered. The wings wobbled. She corrected. Her arms shook violently with resistance. The aircraft trembled like a wounded bird struggling against gravity. The ocean surface rushed closer. She aligned the plane with the wind, just like she'd seen in water landing explanations. No angle too sharp, no tilt too hard. Keep the descent shallow. Keep the glide smooth. The aircraft skimmed. The top of a wave, just barely, sending a spray of white water across the windows. The impact jolted her entire body. The plane bounced once, hard. Passengers screamed, but she held the controls firm, refusing to let fear rip them from her grip. The second bounce came, louder, more violent. The fuselage shuddered. A panel cracked above her. Sparks flew behind the cockpit. But the plane didn't break apart. It slid. Metal screamed against water. Waves crashed against the body. The aircraft dragged across the surface. Slowing as the water swallowed its speed, objects flew down the aisle. Oxygen masks swung wildly. A flight attendant crashed into a seat, gripping the armrest as tears streamed down her face. And then, silence. The plane drifted, floating. Broken, battered, shaking softly, but floating. For a long moment, she couldn't breathe. She didn't know if she'd survived. She didn't know if the others had. She simply sat frozen, staring at the ocean through the cracked windshield, the horizon glowing with golden light. Behind her, a wave of relief swept through the cabin. Cries turned into sobs, sobs of disbelief, gratitude, and overwhelming survival. Passengers clung to each other. Some fell to their knees. Some whispered thanks through trembling hands. The tourist finally released her grip on the controls. Her hands were numb, trembling beyond control. Her entire body felt weak. She wasn't a pilot. She wasn't trained. But she had done what seemed impossible. Minutes later, the first officer stirred again. His eyes opened just enough to understand what had happened. The plane was floating. Passengers alive, sunlight pouring inside. He stared at her with a look of disbelief mixed with awe. Rescue helicopters later found the aircraft. Its wings broken, but its cabin intact. People stood on the floating fuselage, waving with shaking arms. News spread worldwide about the tourist who saved a plane when the pilots fell, unconscious. About the girl who had never touched a real cockpit until that day, yet guided a crippled aircraft to safety. She never called herself a hero, but for every single soul on that plane, she would forever be remembered as the girl who stepped forward when no one else did. She was just a tourist. But that day, she saved an entire plane.